What most people misunderstand about empaths is that their sensitivity is not a weakness. It's a form of intelligence most people will never possess. An empath doesn't just hear your words. They feel the weight behind them. They notice the pause before you speak. They sense the emotion you're trying to hide. They carry your pain sometimes before you've even admitted it to yourself. And because of that gift, because they love deeper, listen harder, and give more than most people ever will, the world often mistakes their softness for an invitation to take advantage. But here's what nobody tells you. An empath's silence is not surrender. Their patience is not permission. And their kindness, the very thing you've been misusing, has a limit. When you push an empath far enough, something shifts, not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently. The person who once made you feel seen, heard, and deeply understood simply stops. Not out of revenge, not out of anger, but out of self-preservation. And what comes next? That absence, that void, that quiet, will teach you everything about what you had and failed to protect. Let's talk about what an empath actually is, because most people have it wrong. When people hear the word empath, they picture someone who cries easily, someone who gets overwhelmed in crowds, someone who is overly sensitive, too emotional, too soft for the real world. And that picture, that misunderstanding, is exactly why empaths get hurt as often as they do. Because what people see on the surface and what is actually happening underneath are two completely different things. An empath is not just a person who feels a lot. That description is too simple, too small. It doesn't capture what is really going on inside them. An empath is someone whose emotional system is wired differently, someone who processes the world not just through their mind, but through their entire being. They don't just observe human experience, they absorb it. Think about what that actually means for a moment. When you walk into a room carrying stress you haven't even spoken out loud, the empath already feels it. When you say you're fine, but you mean the opposite, the empath already knows. When there is tension hiding underneath a smile, pretending to be peace, the empath senses it before a single word confirms it. They are not guessing. They are not overthinking. Their system is simply picking up on frequencies that most people don't even know exist. This is not magic. It is not mystical. It is a form of emotional intelligence so deep, so precise, so finely tuned that it operates almost like a sixth sense. And the reason most people miss it is because it doesn't look the way intelligence is supposed to look. It doesn't show up in arguments or debates. It doesn't perform or prove itself in obvious ways. It works quietly, underneath everything, all the time. And here is what that actually requires of a person. To live as an empath means your nervous system is always working, always receiving, always processing signals that other people never have to deal with. You walk into a conversation and you're not just managing your own emotions, you are managing the unspoken weight of everyone around you. You sit with someone who is hurting, and you don't just sympathize from a comfortable distance. You feel the edges of their pain as if they belong to you. You love someone, and you don't just love who they present themselves to be. You love all the hidden parts they haven't shown anyone else yet. That is not weakness. That is one of the most demanding things a human being can do. But here is where people make the critical mistake. Because empaths are gentle, people assume they are fragile. Because they are patient, people assume they have no limits. Because they give easily and love generously and forgive quickly, people assume that this will always be the case. That the well will never run dry, that the kindness has no end, that no matter how many times they are pushed, the empath will simply adjust, absorb, and continue. And for a long time, they do. Because that is how an empath is built. They are built to hold on, built to understand, built to find the good in people, even when those people are not behaving well. They will sit with your worst moments and still choose to see your potential. They will absorb your anger, your inconsistency, your emotional unavailability, and they will find a way to make sense of it, to excuse it, to believe that underneath it all, you are trying. That is not naivety. That is a profound, almost painful form of loyalty. But what people fail to understand is that this loyalty, this incredible capacity to hold space for others, comes at a cost. Every time an empath absorbs pain that isn't theirs, they carry it somewhere inside themselves. Every time they swallow their own hurt to protect someone else's comfort, it doesn't disappear. It settles. Every time their emotional intelligence is used against them, exploited, ignored, or met with indifference, a quiet damage is being done. Not dramatic, not visible, but real. And the weight of that damage accumulates in a way that most people never see coming, because the empath rarely shows it. This is the paradox at the center of every empath's life. The very skill that makes them so attuned to the people around them also makes them extraordinarily good at managing how much of their own pain they allow others to see. They notice everything in you, but they protect you from everything in them. They will hold your emotional chaos with care and steadiness while quietly carrying their own in silence. They are, without realizing it, practicing a form of emotional self-sacrifice so consistent that it eventually becomes invisible, even to themselves. So from the outside, everything looks fine. The empath is still showing up, still giving, still present, still warm, and the people around them, the ones taking more than they are giving, have no real awareness of what is being quietly eroded beneath that surface. Because empaths don't announce their pain the way other people do. They don't escalate, they don't retaliate, they don't create scenes. What they do instead is something far more internal. They begin to withdraw slowly, carefully, privately, not as a strategy, not as manipulation, but as survival. As a necessary protection of the one thing they've been neglecting while taking care of everyone else. Themselves. And this is what makes the empath's emotional intelligence so misunderstood and so underestimated. People look at their gentleness and assume it equals passivity. People look at their forgiveness and assume it equals unlimited tolerance. People look at their ability to understand everyone else's perspective and assume it means they will never draw a firm line. But that understanding, that deep, clear, penetrating understanding of human behavior, is also what eventually gives the empath the most precise and grounded clarity about what is happening to them. They don't just feel, they understand what they feel. They understand why people behave the way they do. And at some point, after enough observation, after enough patience, after enough quiet accumulation of evidence, they understand with absolute certainty when a situation has become something they can no longer carry. And that clarity, when it arrives, is not loud, is not explosive. It does not come with a dramatic announcement or an emotional outburst. It comes as something far more powerful than anger. It comes as peace, a still, quiet, resolute peace that says, I see this clearly now, I understand what this is, and I am done. Not done in bitterness, not done in hatred, done in the way that only someone who has thought deeply, felt deeply, and given deeply can be done. Done with full awareness, done with no illusions. Done in a way that cannot be undone by a good conversation or a temporary change of behavior or a sudden surge of remorse from the person who caused the harm. Because empaths, once they reach that point, do not go back. Not because they are unforgiving, not because they are cold, but because their emotional intelligence, the same intelligence that helped them see the best in you for so long, is now showing them the full picture. And they trust what they see. This is the power that lives inside sensitivity. This is what is hidden inside all that warmth and care and patience. Not just the capacity to love deeply, but the capacity to know with devastating accuracy when that love is being wasted. And the courage, quiet, private, unshakable courage to act on that knowledge. And empath sensitivity was never the weakness. It was always the weapon they never needed to use. Until you made them, there's a particular kind of pain that empaths carry that most people never fully recognize. Not because it is hidden, but because it doesn't arrive the way pain is supposed to arrive. It doesn't come from a single catastrophic moment. It doesn't come from one terrible argument or one obvious betrayal. It comes slowly, quietly, through a series of small moments that individually seem almost too minor to mention, but collectively over time create damage that goes very deep. This is how empaths get wounded, not all at once, but piece by piece. And the first piece, the one that starts the process, is dismissal. Dismissal is what happens when an empath brings their inner world to someone and that person makes them feel like it doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be cruel. It doesn't have to be loud. It can be as simple as someone changing the subject when the empath expresses something real, or laughing it off, or offering a quick, distracted response when what was shared deserved genuine attention, or that quiet but unmistakable feeling of being heard but not truly listened to. For most people, this kind of moment stings briefly and then fades. They move on without carrying much of it. But for an empath who experiences emotional exchanges at a far deeper level than most, dismissal doesn't just sting, it registers as a fundamental message. It says, what you feel is too much. Who you are is inconvenient. Your depth is a burden. And here is where the wounding becomes complicated, because the empath doesn't respond to that message with anger. They respond with adjustment. They make themselves smaller. They begin to filter what they share. They start monitoring how much of themselves they bring into the room so that the other person stays comfortable. They learn slowly and painfully to shrink. And nobody sees it happening, because on the outside, the empath is still warm, still giving, still present. The adjustment is entirely internal. A private negotiation with themselves in which they agree without realizing it to take up less space in order to protect the relationship. That is not love being received. That is love quietly suffocating. Then there is the second pattern, and this one does even more damage than dismissal because it is harder to name. It is emotional inconsistency. This is the experience of someone who is warm one day and cold the next. Available when it is convenient and absent when it is not. Someone who pulls the empath close and then creates distance without explanation. Someone whose behavior never quite matches their words, who says they care but consistently acts as if caring is optional. For most people, this kind of inconsistency is frustrating. They recognize it as a red flag and either address it directly or begin to detach. But for an empath, something entirely different happens. Because of how deeply they process emotion and how naturally they seek to understand the interior life of others, they don't pull back when someone is inconsistent. They lean in. They start searching for the reason. They start constructing explanations. This person is hurt, this person is scared, this person needs patience, this person has layers that nobody else has taken the time to understand. And that instinct, which comes from a genuinely beautiful place, becomes the very thing that traps them, because they are now working twice as hard to maintain an emotional connection that the other person is barely investing in. They are carrying the weight of two people's emotional experience while the other person moves freely, unburdened, often not even aware of the imbalance. And the empath, rather than recognizing this as an unfair dynamic, reads it as evidence that they simply haven't given enough yet. That if they stay patient a little longer, love a little harder, understand a little more deeply, the inconsistency will resolve itself. It rarely does. But the hope keeps them there long after they should have left. Then comes the third pattern, the one that doesn't just wound the empath, it slowly dismantles them from the inside. Emotional exploitation. This is what happens when someone discovers, consciously or not, that the empath will always show up, that they will always listen, that they will always find a way to hold space, offer comfort, extend grace, and return warmth, even when warmth is not being returned. And instead of honoring that gift, they use it. They begin to bring all of their weight to the empath, every problem, every crisis, every emotional storm, and take everything that is offered without ever asking what the empath might need in return. The relationship becomes dangerously one-directional. The empath pours, the other person receives. And this cycle continues not because the empath is blind to it. They feel it. They sense the imbalance with painful precision, but because their nature makes it almost impossible for them to withhold care from someone who appears to need it. Walking away from someone in pain feels to an empath like an act of cruelty, so they stay. And they keep giving, and the other person keeps taking. And what began as a relationship built on genuine connection quietly transforms into something that only works in one direction. What makes this so destructive is not just the imbalance. It is what the imbalance communicates over time. When you consistently take from someone without reciprocating, without checking in, without noticing, without asking, what you are effectively telling them is that their needs are not important, that they exist to serve your emotional requirements, that their presence in your life is valuable only for what it provides you. And for an empath who already has a tendency to place others above themselves, this message does not create resentment right away. It creates self-erasure. It reinforces a quiet, dangerous belief that their worth is tied to what they can give, not to who they are. And layer by layer, through dismissal, through inconsistency, through exploitation, the empath begins to lose touch with themselves. They forget what they need because they have spent so long focused on what everyone else needs. They stop recognizing their own emotional exhaustion because they have normalized pushing through it. They begin to feel guilty for having limits, guilty for feeling tired, guilty for the moments when they cannot give more, as if their humanity, their very human need to be cared for in return, is somehow a failure. This is the cruelest part of how empaths get wounded. It is not the external damage that hurts the most. It is the internal disconnection, the slow, quiet loss of their own sense of self that cuts the deepest. And still, through all of it, they stay soft, they stay patient, they stay present. Not because they are unaware, but because their capacity for empathy extends even to the people who are hurting them. They understand why people are the way they are. They see the fear behind the coldness, the wound behind the walls, the unmet need behind the inconsistency. And that understanding makes it almost impossible to stop caring, even when caring is costing them everything. But here is the truth that sits underneath all of this. Understanding someone's pain does not mean you are required to become a casualty of it. Recognizing why someone behaves the way they do does not mean their behavior stops causing damage. Empathy, real deep true empathy, is not the same as self-sacrifice. And no amount of love, patience, or understanding can heal a wound in someone else that they are not willing to face themselves. The empath has to learn this, often the hard way, often after carrying far more than they ever should have been asked to carry. Because nobody sat them down and explained that their sensitivity deserved protection too, that their emotional depth was not a resource for others to mine, that their capacity to love was never meant to be a substitute for the love they were not receiving in return. Every dismissal ignored, every inconsistency excused, every act of exploitation absorbed, it doesn't just wound the empath. It teaches them slowly that they are not worthy of what they so freely give to everyone else. That is the real damage. And it is the one that takes the longest to undo. There is a moment that happens inside an empath that most people never see coming because it doesn't look the way people expect a breaking point. Look, it is not a screaming match. It is not a dramatic confrontation. It is not a flood of tears or a door slammed shut or a long list of grievances finally spoken out loud. It doesn't arrive with noise or chaos or the kind of visible explosion that signals to everyone in the room that something has gone seriously wrong. It arrives in silence. A specific kind of silence that feels, from the inside, completely different from anything the empath has ever experienced before. Not the silence of someone who has given up. Not the silence of defeat, but the silence of someone who has finally, after absorbing so much for so long, become completely still, completely clear, completely decided. This is the moment of shift, and it is one of the most misunderstood things about how empaths operate. To understand why this moment is so significant, you have to understand what leads up to it, because it does not come from nowhere. It is not sudden, even though it appears that way from the outside. It is the result of an accumulation, a long, quiet, invisible accumulation of moments that were never fully processed, never fully addressed, never fully healed. Every time the empath swallowed their hurt to keep the peace, that moment was stored. Every time they extended grace when grace was not returned, that was stored. Every time they made themselves smaller, quieter, more accommodating than they should have had to be, all of it was stored. Not forgotten, not released, stored. Building layer by layer in a place so deep that even the empath could not always access it consciously. And on the surface, life continued. The empath kept showing up, kept giving, kept trying to find the good, kept choosing patience, kept returning warmth to people who were running cold, because that is what empaths do. Their capacity to hold on, to believe in people, to find meaning even inside pain is extraordinary. It is one of the most defining things about who they are. But capacity has a ceiling. And when you spend long enough pushing someone past theirs, even someone as emotionally spacious as an empath, something eventually shifts. What triggers it is rarely the biggest thing that has happened. This is important to understand. The moment of shift is almost never caused by the most dramatic event in the relationship. It is not usually the worst argument or the most obvious betrayal or the single cruelest thing that was ever said. More often than not, it is something quiet, something almost small. A moment that, on its own, would seem completely ordinary to anyone watching from the outside. Maybe it is a look. Maybe it is the absence of a response that should have come easily. Maybe it is a familiar pattern repeating itself one final time, the same dismissal, the same inconsistency, the same sense of being unseen. And something inside the empath simply recognizes it with a clarity that was not available before. And in that moment, instead of moving into their usual response, instead of absorbing, adjusting, rationalizing, forgiving, something different happens. They see it fully, completely, without the softening that hope usually provides, not with anger, not with bitterness, with clarity. The kind of clarity that arrives when you have finally stopped trying to see something differently than it actually is. When the story you have been telling yourself about potential, about change, about what this relationship could become, quietly falls away and what is left is just the truth. Plain and still and undeniable. This is what the shift actually is. It is not an emotional event, it is a perceptual one. The empath does not suddenly feel more, they suddenly see more. Or rather, they allow themselves to finally see what has been there all along, what their emotional intelligence was pointing to long before they were ready to accept it. What some part of them already knew quietly in the background of every conversation and every forgiven slight and every moment they chose to stay. And what makes this shift so permanent, so different from every other difficult moment they have moved through, is that it bypasses emotion entirely. It is not driven by pain. It is not driven by anger. It is not even driven by exhaustion. Though all of those things are present, it is driven by something colder and more grounded than any of them. It is driven by knowing. And here is what makes that so significant for an empath specifically. Because empaths feel so deeply, people often assume they are led entirely by their emotions, that their decisions are emotional decisions. But if you appeal to their feelings, if you show enough remorse, enough vulnerability, enough of the warmth they've always wanted from you, you can reach them. You can pull them back. You can undo what has been done. But the shift changes that equation completely. Because once an empath has moved out of feeling and into knowing, once they have arrived at that quiet, clear, grounded place of absolute understanding, emotion can no longer override it. You can cry, you can apologize, you can suddenly become everything they ever needed you to be, right there in the moment they have finally decided to stop needing it. And they will feel all of that. They will feel your remorse, they will feel your pain, they will understand it with the same depth and precision they have always brought to your experience. But it will no longer change anything, because what they know is now louder than what they feel. And for an empath, someone who has lived their entire life navigating the world primarily through feeling, the arrival of that kind of knowing is not just a shift in the relationship. It is a shift in themselves. Something reorganizes internally. Something that was once open begins, not to close exactly, but to settle, to solidify. The part of them that always left the door slightly open, that always maintained some small, quiet hope that things could be different, stops waiting. Not dramatically, not with a proclamation. It simply stops. The way a candle goes out when the air finally runs still. And this is the part that the people who cause the damage almost never understand until it is far too late. They are used to the empath coming back. They are used to the forgiveness, the grace, the willingness to try again. They have seen the empath hurt before and recover and return. And so they operate, consciously or not, with a kind of quiet confidence that this will always be the case. That no matter what happens, the empath will find their way back. That the connection is too deep, the love too real, the bond too strong for things to ever truly end. What they do not realize is that this confidence is built entirely on the version of the empath that existed before the shift. The version that was still processing, still hoping, still choosing to see potential over pattern. That version is gone now. What stands in its place is not a colder person, not a damaged person, not someone hardened by pain into something unrecognizable. What stands there is someone who has finally, fully turned their own emotional intelligence toward themselves. Someone who is now applying the same depth of understanding that they have always offered to everyone else, to their own experience, their own needs, their own worth. And what that understanding tells them, with a quietness that carries more weight than any argument ever could, is simple. This is not what I deserve. I see that now. I see it fully. And I am done carrying what was never mine to carry. No announcement, no ultimatum, no final dramatic scene. Just a decision made in the deepest, most grounded part of who they are. Made not out of anger, not out of revenge, not even out of hurt, but out of a self-respect that has finally, after everything, been allowed to speak. And the most striking thing about this moment, the thing that makes it so irreversible, is how peaceful it feels. Not happy, not relieved, not even sad, exactly. Just still. The way the air feels after a long storm has finally passed. Everything is clear, everything is quiet. And the empath, for the first time in longer than they can remember, is no longer bracing for the next wave, because they have stepped out of the storm entirely. Not running, not fleeing. Simply, and with great quiet dignity, walking in a different direction. The shift is not the end of the empath. It is the moment they finally choose themselves. And that choice, once made from that depth, does not get unmade. There is a specific kind of regret that only arrives after you have lost something you never truly appreciated while you had it. Not the regret of a mistake you made in a moment of weakness. Not the regret of a bad decision made under pressure. But the slow, settling regret of realizing, too late, always too late, that what you treated as ordinary was never ordinary at all. This is the regret that comes after breaking an empath. And it is unlike any other regret you will experience in your life. It does not arrive immediately. That is the first thing to understand. In the beginning, when the empath first steps back, when their presence begins to fade and their warmth starts to withdraw, you may not even register it as a loss. You might feel a brief sense of relief. The relationship was intense. Their depth was demanding, even when they never asked anything directly. Their emotional awareness could make you feel exposed in ways you were not always comfortable with. And so when the weight of that connection begins to lift, there is a moment, a small deceptive moment, where the absence feels like space, like freedom almost, but that feeling does not last. And when it fades, what replaces it is something you will not be fully prepared for. You start to notice the silence, not the peaceful kind, the kind that has texture, the kind that reminds you, constantly and without mercy, of everything that used to fill it. You reach for your phone to share something, and the person you instinctively want to tell is no longer available in the way they were. You have a hard day, and you realize slowly that no one around you is going to feel the weight of it the way they did. Not because the people in your life don't care, but because caring the way an empath cares is not a common thing. It is not something you can simply find elsewhere because you decided what you had was no longer worth protecting. And this is when the regret begins to take shape. It starts small, a memory that surfaces unexpectedly. A moment where someone responds to you with a fraction of the understanding the empath always offered so naturally, and you feel the gap between those two things so sharply it almost takes your breath away. A conversation that stays on the surface because the person you are talking to does not have the capacity or the desire to go any deeper. And you sit with that surface level exchange, and something in you aches for a depth that you now understand you took completely for granted. Because that is the nature of what an empath offers. It is so consistently present, so reliably given, that you stop recognizing it as something rare. You begin to treat it as a baseline, as the standard you expect from connection, as simply the way things are. And you forget, or perhaps you never truly understood in the first place, that what you were receiving was extraordinary, that most people go their entire lives without ever being seen, understood, and held the way an empath holds the people they love. You had that, and you did not protect it. And now in its absence, you are beginning to understand its value in the cruelest possible way, by feeling exactly what life looks like without it. There is also something else that happens during this period of loss, something more uncomfortable than the sadness, something that sits underneath the longing and demands to be looked at even when you would rather not. It is the moment you begin to replay things, not broadly, not in vague terms, in specific detail. You start going back through moments that you moved through carelessly at the time, moments where the empath showed you something real about how they felt, and you dismissed it. Moments where they needed something from you, not much, never much, and you were too distracted, too self-focused, too comfortable in the assumption that they would always be there to actually show up. Moments where their patience was so steady and their forgiveness so reliable that you mistook those things for a permanent condition rather than what they actually were. A gift that was slowly, quietly running out. And as you replay those moments, something shifts inside you. Because the story you told yourself at the time, that you weren't doing anything wrong, that they were too sensitive, that the dynamic was fine, that they would come around, starts to fall apart under honest examination. You start to see it for what it was, not from their perspective initially, but from yours. And from yours, with the distance of loss providing a clarity that comfort never could, you see choices you made. Moments where you could have shown up differently and chose not to. Moments where you could have offered the kind of attention they always offered you and decided it wasn't necessary. Moments where you treated their emotional generosity as a given, rather than as something that required you to show up in return. That recognition is not easy to sit with. Because when you hurt most people and they leave, you can construct a narrative that distributes the blame broadly. You can tell yourself the relationship was complicated, the dynamic was unhealthy on both sides, that it simply wasn't working. And there is often enough truth in those stories to make them feel reasonable. But with an empath, that narrative is harder to maintain because their love was so clear, their investment was so visible, their willingness to understand, to forgive, to stay was so consistent and so real that it is very difficult, in honest retrospect, to look at the relationship and not see plainly who was giving and who was taking. Who was building and who was eroding? Who was loving and who was consuming that love without consideration for what it cost? And the guilt that comes with that recognition is a particular kind of heavy. It is not the guilt that makes you want to fix things, because deep down you understand that the door is no longer open in the way it used to be. It is the guilt that makes you want to go back, not even to fix things, but simply to have done better when it mattered, when it still could have mattered. When the empath was still there, still choosing you, still holding space for the version of you that you were never quite willing to grow into. That is the grief inside the regret. The mourning of the person you could have been in relation to someone who believed in that version of you long before you were ready to believe in it yourself. And then, perhaps hardest of all, comes the moment when you truly understand who it is you lost. Not just the relationship, not just the comfort of their presence or the ease of their understanding, but them, the actual person. You begin to see with a clarity that only absence can provide the full scale of who they were, how much they carried without complaint, how much they gave without keeping score, how much they felt, not just their own experience, but yours and everyone else's around them, and still chose to show up with warmth and patience and care. You begin to understand that the sensitivity you perhaps found inconvenient at times was actually evidence of a kind of strength you may never fully possess. That the depth you found overwhelming was the same depth that made you feel, when they turned it toward you, more seen than you had ever felt in your life. That the love they offered, steady, perceptive, and without condition, was not something that will simply appear again in the next person you meet. Some things, once gone, reveal their true weight only through their absence. Some people, once lost, teach you more about what love is supposed to look like than all the relationships that came before them combined. And you will carry that education forward. Perhaps into better choices, perhaps into greater awareness, perhaps into the kind of presence and reciprocity you were never quite willing to offer before. But you will carry it without them. Because the empath you broke did not leave to teach you a lesson. They left to save themselves. The regret you are living in now is not something they designed for you. It is simply the natural consequence of not valuing something extraordinary until the moment it was no longer yours to take for granted. The most painful lessons are always the ones where you only understand what you had after it's already gone. What most people don't understand about an empath walking away is that they are not walking away broken. They are walking away becoming. There is a transformation that happens inside an empath after they have been pushed to their limit, after they have finally made that quiet, grounded decision to choose themselves. And it is one of the most profound shifts a human being can go through, not because it is dramatic, not because it is loud, but because it is real. It is the kind of change that goes all the way down to the foundation of who a person is. And what gets built on that foundation afterward is something entirely different from what existed before. But to understand the rebirth, you have to understand what the empath is leaving behind, not just the relationship, not just the person who caused the damage. They are leaving behind a version of themselves, a version that was built over time around accommodation, around making space for everyone else while quietly compressing their own space smaller and smaller, around giving and forgiving and adjusting and returning, until giving became so automatic that they had nearly forgotten that receiving was something they were allowed to need. That version of themselves was not weak. Let that be said clearly. It was not weakness that made them give so much. It was depth. It was a genuinely extraordinary capacity for love and understanding that most people spend their entire lives never accessing. But that depth, for a long time, had no boundary around it. It flowed outward freely and continuously toward everyone else, while the empath themselves stood at the center of it, slowly becoming depleted in a way they could not always name. Walking away changes that, and the change does not happen all at once. It happens in layers. In quiet moments that accumulate the way the damage once did, gradually, privately building into something significant before the full shape of it becomes visible. The first thing that shifts is the silence. For the first time in a long time, the empath is alone with themselves in a way that is not colored by someone else's needs, someone else's emotional weather, someone else's unresolved pain. And that silence in the beginning can feel unfamiliar, even uncomfortable, because they have spent so long attuned to the frequency of other people that turning that attention inward requires a kind of relearning, a reorientation toward their own interior life that was neglected for far too long. But inside that silence, something begins to happen. They start to hear themselves again. Not the version of themselves that was always monitoring how others were feeling, not the version that was always calculating how to respond, how to help, how to hold, but the original version. The one that exists underneath all the giving, the one that has its own desires, its own perceptions, its own sense of what feels right and what does not. The one that never disappeared, only got buried under the weight of everyone else. And as that voice gets clearer, something remarkable begins to take place. The emotional intelligence that the empath always directed outward starts to turn. It begins to work for them instead of being spent on others. The same depth of perception that once helped them understand everyone around them now helps them understand themselves, their patterns, their worth, their needs, the ways they allowed themselves to be diminished, and why. And this self-understanding is not painful in the way the past was painful. It is clarifying. It is the difference between standing in the middle of a storm and standing somewhere quiet, watching the storm from a distance, finally able to see its full shape. This is where the empath begins to rebuild, not from scratch, but from a much deeper and more honest foundation than what existed before. Because here is what the experience of being hurt, truly hurt, the way only someone of this depth can be hurt, leaves behind. It leaves behind discernment. A refined, precise, almost surgical ability to recognize what is real and what is performance, what is genuine care and what is the appearance of it. What is a healthy dynamic and what is one that will, over time, ask them to disappear into it? An empath who has been through this process does not become cynical. They become clear. And there is a profound difference between those two things. Cynicism closes. Clarity opens, but selectively, with intention, with a level of awareness that was not available before, because before, hope was always slightly louder than observation. Now they are balanced. The heart and the perception working together instead of the heart always overriding what the perception was quietly trying to say. This makes the empath, in the truest sense, more powerful than they have ever been. Not powerful in a hard way, not powerful in a guarded, defended, keep everyone at a distance way, but powerful in the way that comes from being fully rooted in yourself, from knowing what you will offer and what you will no longer accept, From understanding that your emotional depth is a gift, a real, rare, significant gift, and that gifts of this magnitude deserve to be received with care. They deserve to be met with reciprocity. They deserve a home that honors them rather than exploits them. And the empath now knows the difference. They can feel it immediately. Where before they might have rationalized away early signs of imbalance, might have given the benefit of the doubt long past the point where doubt had already been answered. Now they trust what they feel in the earliest moments. They trust their perception. They trust the quiet signal that arises when something is off, because they have learned at great cost what happens when that signal is ignored. This does not make them closed. It makes them honest. They still love, perhaps more fully than before, because now they love without the anxiety of constantly managing other people's emotions at the expense of their own. They still give. But they give from a full place rather than an already depleted one. They still extend understanding and compassion and warmth because those things are not casualties of what they went through. Those things are core to who they are. They cannot be taken away. They can only be redirected. And now they are directed with wisdom rather than without limit. There is also something else that emerges during this rebirth, something quieter, but perhaps the most significant shift of all. Self-worth that is no longer conditional. Before, in ways the empath may not have fully recognized, their sense of value was connected to what they could provide, to how well they could love, how deeply they could understand, how reliably they could show up. Their worth lived in their usefulness to others. And so when those others failed to honor what was being given, when the giving was taken for granted, exploited, or simply not met with any meaningful return, it did not just feel like a relational failure. On some level, it felt like a personal one, like maybe they had not given enough, like maybe they were not enough. The rebirth dismantles that belief completely, because in the silence, in the clarity, in the slow and patient work of returning to themselves, the empath begins to understand something they perhaps always knew intellectually but never fully felt in their bones. That they are not valuable because of what they give. They are valuable because of who they are. And who they are does not change based on whether someone chooses to see it. Does not shrink because someone failed to honor it. Does not require external validation to remain true. That realization, when it settles, is not loud. It does not arrive as a celebration. It arrives as a quiet, steady, unshakable sense of self that becomes the new foundation for everything that follows, for every relationship they enter, for every boundary they hold, for every moment they choose themselves without guilt and without apology. And the person who broke them, the one who pushed them past their limit, who took the gift of their love and treated it carelessly, did not create this version of the empath. They only accelerated a becoming that was always waiting to happen. The empath was always going to find this place. The only thing the pain did was remove every reason to delay. So no, walking away did not destroy the empath, it freed them. It stripped away everything that was asking them to be less than they are. And what remained, what is standing now in the quiet aftermath of all that loss, is more grounded, more clear, more genuinely powerful than anything that existed before. You did not break them, you built them, and they will spend the rest of their life becoming someone you no longer have access to.